social and economic development. And the question is whether our foundation is strong enough. And so what it does is that it necessarily takes one to the question of our constitution basically does or does not achieve that objective. So I'm a lawyer, so I must always look at the constitution. I'm going to just talk for the next few minutes about how the constitution impacts my own area of expertise as it connects to the subject at hand.
Right.
So first of all, I'm a natural resource practitioner, but then I also practice within the larger, wide area of infrastructure. And so from time to time, I'm confronted with our constitution. And, I'm always conflicted around what is or what should be and what should be. So we have this constitution that we love to hate. It's brought us together. It is federal by design, unitary in practice. So there's this contention between federal and state forces and all the potentates within it. So let's go, for instance, and look at what the Constitution does in terms of development within areas, right? Of interest to me. The Constitution says that there's certain uses of land that are priority land uses. Now, for the context of this talk, let's focus on areas such as railway development, mining, and petroleum exploitation. And let's see what the Constitution does and question whether it actually helps us attain development or not, and see whether we can tweak it. So the current law relating to rail development was enacted in 1948, the Railway Act. The British were in control of Nigeria, that territory, at that point in time. And they organized the railway system for their own purposes, basically to move produce and natural resources from various parts of the country to the ports for export. So basically, it was an extractive piece of infrastructure. Several years on, Nigeria's population has grown fourfold. And we now need to have a railway system that works more efficiently for, but if you were a state government, or a state governor rather, and you needed to develop a rail system within the territory of your state, according to current law, which is encased in the Constitution, enshrined, we lawyers say, you will have to apply to the managing director of the Nigerian Railway Corporation for approval to build a rail line or a rail system. He would be bound to put the application to his minister. The minister would be bound to go to the president for approval. And depending on who the president for the time being is, if that governor was not in a contiguous political party, that railway line or system would not be developed within that state. So my point is this, time has come, 60 years on, for this anachronism to go, right? Railway lines engender development. I think that's a given, right? Let us come to the point where any state should be free to develop lines, right, as it sees fit. Of course, there's a federal rail system, so the important thing is the interconnection with the federal system. But it is wrong for you to have to go all the way to Abuja, beg, scrape to get approval. It doesn't help the country. Okay, so that's one issue. And I've got 3 minutes, I believe. Let's go to mining. So I was coming back from the United States from sabbatical, and one of my first tasks the early 2000s was to develop to write the mining code for Nigeria. Coming from a federal system, I thought naturally, every state should have the power of control over the mining of mineral resources within its territory. Again, I went back to my constitution. It's very clear, right? The constitution arrogates ownership of mineral resources and petroleum, right, to the federal government. Then, of course, we've seen what has happened since. We have a mining sector that is crawling literally. Of course, I had no choice. I had to draft in accordance with the Constitution. No choice about the matter. My remit was not to amend the Constitution. My remit was to draft law, and that law had to be consistent with the Constitution. So here we are today. We have a mining legislation that basically starts by acknowledging the power of the federal government, its ownership over mining resources. But we all know that the minerals in literally every state of the Federation occurring. But when you look at the mining map of West Africa, there are mines everywhere, hardly any operating in the country. Perhaps we could have faster development of our minerals if the states own those minerals. So that's a food for thought. Same goes for our petroleum resources. So we're very emotive over petroleum, but this is the country where rights over petroleum resources are granted to individuals, some of whom now become stupendously richer than some states where millions of people wallow in poverty. I just wonder, is it not about time we took another look at this and see whether it might help to grant some of these resources directly to state governments? So my 5 minutes up, but this is just thoughts, food for thought.
Those are opening thoughts, and thank you very much. You know, this is slightly different from what I promised, but maybe to make this a bit more iterative, so it's not also such a linear conversation, the panel can actually intervene. 1-2 minutes to intervene and respond to Gbite, and after every presentation, the panel would have the opportunity to respond to that presentation. So does anybody want to jump in on what, you can unmute yourself and take about 2 minutes to respond to Gbite? Generally, and it's not mandatory, but is there anybody who wants to answer, respond, or add to what he just said? Okay, looks like we're saving our gunpowder. So we'll just scoot over very quickly to Mrs. Uwais, who I believe is going to be taking the subject from the perspective of the law. Prof, did you want to say something? Okay, so
well, I just wanted to be a bit provocative. Even though I'll probably, as you say, speak to some of the things that Gbite has raised. He talks about probably, instead of people being stupendously rich, the state's governments or maybe even the local governments should control those resources. I just want to provoke a bit on two fronts. One is that, well, will it make any difference if the state's governments or unit governments control those resources? Because the issue is not really about the revenue, deriving the revenue, but it's also about accountability, transparency, and good governance in terms of how the revenue is used. Then on the second leg of it, I must also say that I like some of the points he's made, because I'm a Lagosian, for example, and Lagos State has acquired vast amounts of lands from the people of the indigens, and it has more or less transferred wealth from the the owners of the land to the states and pauperized the people. Much more land than it really needs to have. And then you now have allocations to left, right, and center, and even government officials, sort of cheat the natives in terms of these land resources. And much of the wealth of Lagos state government is derived from that type of bondugu. So Gbite has opened a Pandora's box, I think. So that's just what I'd like to say. There are many areas to,
all right, thanks, Prof.
To dive into what he has said. But so let me just keep it
we'll interrogate that a bit. Let me invite Mrs. Uwais to open another channel of this conversation, who I believe will be talking more to law and development, social development, human capital development, and the rest of it. Mrs. Uwais?
Yes, so good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to this very interesting and hopefully interactive session. For me, I mean, I've worked more in the social sector than I have in other sectors. So my concern is the manner in which we tend to focus more on infrastructure when we speak about development rather than the quality of life and the human capital indices that we actually require to utilize that infrastructure. And because these issues are intangible, for instance, the issue of education, you cannot measure it and see returns on investment immediately. You can't leave it as a legacy per se, or even with health, it is over a period of time. We tend to trivialize or not prioritize those issues. And much as we need the infrastructure, we need to address the issues of poverty and the human beings that actually require the infrastructure. Otherwise, the infrastructure will lie fallow. And I say this all the time. You can build a primary school in a community where you have poor people. Even if you put in the best teachers and the best, you build a good school that's secure and has all the material, unless you address the poverty that is endemic in that community, those children will not go to that school. They will continue to go with their father to the farm, or they will go to the market to hawk, because we have not addressed. The children are at the mercy of their parents, and their parents determine what happens. So unless we can find how we can supplement the income or empower the father or the mother to actually source some measure of, and they have dignity and they can live a decent life, those children who actually represent free labor for them are not going to engage with the infrastructure that we provide. And so this is why I say all the time, infrastructure is critical, but so is human capital. But the challenge is our politicians who take the decisions as to what is priority in budget don't look at education, they don't look at health, they would rather leave legacies that can be pointed at to say, this is what I built in my time, this is what I achieved. And besides, the concrete, going back to what Professor Olawale said, the contracts are given in such spaces, not for the human capital. And this has grown worse because the people that are really poor don't have any networks, they don't have the education to engage with the social media, they can't engage with the journalists. So the quiet is assumed to be satisfaction. And you find people saying, if you have money, let's build this and let's build that. And when it comes to empowering the people, because they don't say anything, presumption is that they're fine, And this is how very quietly, but very steadily, the disparities have grown between those that are really poor, and those that think they have all the answers. And we don't engage with them. We don't take the trouble to find out what their own priorities are. For us, it's important for us to have these massive bridges.
We seem to have lost your voice, Maryam. I don't know why.
And
Okay, you're back now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Hear you.
Yeah, so I'm saying these huge projects, these airports that we're building, despite the fact that the states are so close together, we can actually utilize the resources and the resources of they're not priority. The issues of the very poor are not priority. So for me, development means that we actually focus on the needs of the majority of our people, because like it or not, we have huge numbers. And unfortunately, even the private sector wants to see immediate returns on investment. So it's a huge deal, you know, getting the banks to try and engage the huge numbers of people who are very poor. They're more interested in high net worth individuals, and they sit back and the money grows and they make a good profit. But the task of engaging people and putting them through financial literacy, getting them to understand how they can borrow and take credit and grow their businesses, that is not for them. You know, we seem to have sunk into this, I don't know, we're floating along believing we're okay, but we must find a way of compelling the prioritization of certain, you know, sectors for us to be able to engage with inclusive development, inclusive growth. And for me, this is where the challenge lies. How do we get, even when we vote for education, we're not building schools, we're looking at the quality of teachers that get there. How do we secure the way, the paths to the schools? There are many communities that don't even have a primary school now, and their children learning under the trees. And there's learning going on. You know, how do we bring all of that together? And how do we have it in one space? And I am going to be very provocative, because for me, you know, yes, a federation is, I don't really know what true federation means, because every country that has a federation has chosen what is exclusive and what is concurrent and what is, everything else is residual. But for me, we have to have a social space that engages with every Nigerian. And that for me is critical. We must find a way of compelling the prioritization of these issues in every state, not just at federal level, because this is where the challenge lies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, okay. Those quick interventions. I have, I'm not sure if I can use Prof's expression of the Pandora's voice, box, but Mrs. Uwais has certainly raised a couple or so. Just so that I don't forget, please, Mrs. Uwais, I would want to ask at some point if legislation or the legal framework can be used to drive this change. You know, that's something you should say for now. But interventions.
I just love all she said, really. It's very exciting stuff, because, you know, I've always said that, look, our political culture, right, isn't development focused sufficiently, right? Okay. If anything, it's extractive, right? So when she says what she says, it's like she gets it. And I just wish that this kind of mindset, this kind of thinking, right, is what our political actors would adopt. Because ultimately, governance is about driving development down to the lowest level of the people, really. Ultimately, it must work. This thing called democracy must work for the people, right? Okay, so it's not working. But there's a relationship, though, right, between infrastructure, right, development, right, and all the social sectors. Because, take for instance, you're farming. We need to move these goods conveniently around the country. So the roads and the rail systems, they're important, right? But equally important, and she's spot on, are the hospitals and the schools, right, and every other thing, right, that basically makes life just more abundant, right, for the ordinary people, which is what we expect our governance at the local and state level to be able to take on board. So yes, I'm about what she has to say.
Okay, that's fine. I mean, we're getting to that, but just so I remind us that what I'm hoping we'll be able to unravel and crack at some point today is this. What is it that drives, I mean, what is the intangible that drives the tangible? Because again, if we're talking about governance and the behavior and the culture, but all of that is sitting on top of, you know, it's an infrastructure. And it would seem to me that we're talking about the mezzanine and the superstructure, but perhaps we'll be able to unravel the infrastructure, which is indeed the legal framework. Dr. Amadi, I think it's your turn to open up the conversation.
Okay, can you hear me then?
Very clearly.
Okay, I think I'm happy to hear Dr. Uwais or Mr. Uwais, whichever.
Not doctor. Thank you.
But I think first, let's start with the relationship between law and economic development or any kind of development will first depend on the concept of the rule of law. You know, we talk about rule of law, but we don't talk about role of law. The rule of law is different, but I think it's more important to focus on what role should law play, first and foremost. And the legal theories, we will put it on, legal theories conflict themselves because, take for example, after independence, during the independence struggle, the concept of law and the concept of law post-independence, early period of independence, when most African countries were concerned about, based on the then dominant economic theory, people like Lewis and their idea of capital accumulation, the sense was that what accounted for development was capital deficit, and therefore development required accumulation of capital. So most African developing countries, law was used to create surplus in terms of appropriating from the local and creating, stock of assets to create big infrastructural developments, big other projects in the landscape. So law had a role to play. Now, law also had a role to play of redefining the relationship between independent countries and the centers of power. So today we talk about law as if law is neutral. Law is just rule of law. But what about rule of law? So one way to perceive Ms. Uwais' concept is that law actually can play two different ways, rules. Law can play the role of empowering people, reducing inequality, bridging the gap in equality, increasing human livelihood, improving all those indicators that the UNDP signal for you. Law can also play a role in creating a different kind of outcome in which we create billionaires. We have seemingly Fortune 500 kind of companies, but underneath it is a large swath of poor persons who have access to no basic resources. Okay, now let's take two countries, even in Asia. Let's take South Korea and let's take Malaysia. Now, if you look at we all see them as doing fine. Now, Malaysia boasts of great billionaires who made it through estates. You go to Hong Kong, Malaysia, you see big high rise, okay? Now, if you go to South Korea or Japan, or even China or the East Asian countries, you see that the whole economic development was engineered by a specific kind of use of law. First, agrarian revolution that they used to reform the land tenure system and focus on smallholder farming that helped to create improve household income that then led to industrialization. It was actually agrarian reform that led to industrialization in Asia and the East, in Korea and the East Asian countries. The reverse happened in Malaysia. The law was used to create plantations, commercial farming. So today, this government is trying their best, it's focused on agriculture revolution. And I've had a conversation with the SSA on agriculture, smart guy. I said, look, focus on smallholder. Use the law to push credit, push support to smallholders. But they're the ones who are going to, first, they will secure food security, but they're not going to export to the outside the country. Two, you're going to improve, reduce poverty, and then you're going to diversify economic growth. So the point I want to signal that when we talk about law, as if that's one brand of law or one role law plays, it's not clever enough. Again, how law is deployed is also a function of politics. The politics in the sense of who access power and who are the technical advisors. So someone like Ms. Uwais will be worried about how people are left behind economically. So if she was to design legal framework, she would design it to build around the issues of human capability, issues around inclusion. The other point I want to raise is that focus on what kind of development and whose development. So the notion that there's a big contestation here, and I give you an example, it's just like what's going on now on tariff. I teach a course, social justice, and I was looking at utilitarian theory. I was looking at cost-benefit analysis. And a minister of this government was in that class, and another person who was a chief executive of a bank and so on. And so the debate was subsidy removal. And they argued, the guy who is a former chief executive said, look, it was wrong that the government liberation of the oil, the gas sector is not utilitarian in that they didn't look at the greatest benefit of the largest number of people. The minister says, no. If we save 2 trillion, smart argument, and put it in doing trade, we can decongest Abuja and Lagos, and workers will be coming from Abeokuta, where they have cheaper housing, to come to work in Lagos, from Kaduna and elsewhere. And so I now have to arbitrate. I say, look, you guys, now let's first expand our cost-benefit spreadsheet. Let's look at how the increase will affect people who have no exit. That means theoretically, some workers have no exit. They can't change from petrol-based car to gas-based car. They can't track. So the point I'm trying to make, therefore, is that we are not using a different kind of legal theory. We're required to use an expansive cost-benefit spreadsheet to factor some of the things that public policy is not factoring. Factor some of the things that, for example, the president says today, it doesn't make sense that we're going to have the least cheaper oil, petrol than Saudi, Ghana. That's fine, fantastic. But then Saudi has 350,000 naira as minimum wage, and Nigeria has 30,000. Ghana, the cost of transport of goods from the port or Pitema to any part of Ghana is less than 15% of the cost of inland freight in Nigeria. So the point I'm trying to make is that, look, we need a theory of change also in law and development to say what do we want? What are we focusing on? The other point I want to make is the issue around inequality. Now, in the US at some point, the law and economics movement was strongest, building also from the influence of economists who also used economic insights to infuse in legal analysis. Then we have those who are also contrary to that view, who show that looking at the idea that the market force or the market forces or market force is the best framework to maximize wealth, which is what the law and economics people say that what the court do in every case, whether it's tort, whether it's trust, whether it's contract, is to maximize wealth. And therefore the courts do and ought to follow how the market would have resolved. Whether we're doing carbon credit, whether we're doing pricing of electricity or pricing of gas, these legal concepts and law and economics mixed together. Now, what's missing in this country is that even our law faculties and our professional practice, MBA particularly, we're not paying attention to this intersection between law, economics, political science, sociology, in framing the tools of development that we deploy as technocrats. So we assume that it's like it's like fait accompli. This is a natural grid. We just plug and play. But these policies we import as part of a technocratic transformation are themselves very agreeable issues around legal theory, around legal insight, and the interaction between law and economy. So what I would say for further is that law is a critical driver of development. But the question which I'm doing and I work on that is that how has legal reform affected development in Africa? Is it a question at some point legal reform was hijacked and transformed into if you like, a theory of status quo, a theory of recreating society in the image of inequality? So to end, let me ask this question. Can we say that our inequality today, Nigeria has one of the largest Gini coefficient inequality, the most unequal country in the world? Nigeria includes one of the first three. And so the question is also poverty. Can we solve this problem without dealing with legal theory and legal application of legal rules? And then finally on this, Oxford made 3 points about
Doc.
The last finally, Oxford made 3 points about what it's a one, budget spend, and Ms. Uwais has talked about it. How is our budget allocated? The second is that he said we have used legal reform to remove protections around labor rights. And so when I was a labor specialist for the UAE, said many years ago, an idea is that if you look at our labor rules, if you look at there's no protection for workers. And therefore what you are doing is that you are reducing their access to the benefits. And so when you do those things in the name of making Nigeria good for investment, the outcome is that you are increasing poverty and inequality. And in the long term, huge inequality, large poverty will be the most difficult drag on development, because you need to have a large number of people with consuming capability to stimulate production in a sustainable.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Doc. Even though you did exceed a bit of my time, but interesting concepts, open them up. I'm talking legal theory. You know me, I'm a bit more pragmatic than that. I'm looking at more legal framework that sits on those theories. And I agree with you that we need to understand the theories before we develop the frameworks. But ultimately, we need to be able to tell the story of our development in terms of the people indices. I mean, I like the way China engages or discusses their economic development. They describe the economic development in 2 terms: the number of people they've lifted out of poverty and the number of people they've taken into wealth. Those are, and that's probably one way to look at it. Any intervention from the panel to Dr. Amadi's opening speech or remarks? Otherwise, we'll scoot very quickly to Professor Ajai, you know, and just take your own opener to see what your perspective to law and development is. And the question again remains, is the law as it is presently framed robust enough to support development, social and economic development? That's probably one of the questions I'm looking to get some insights into.
Yes, thank you very much. In my view, I think, yes, maybe you say yes. I wouldn't say yes or no, I would say yes with conditions. Yes, in the sense that the constitutional frameworks are there, particularly when you look at Chapter 2, which supposedly sets the tone for how governance should be prosecuted or advanced. So you see in Chapter 2 the buttresses of what you may call natural justice theory, comes through in Chapter 2, in the sense of ensuring that the state works for the generality of citizens, that the state works in the national interest, that the direction of governance is developmental. although it does seem to suggest a more socialistic, framework by retaining that section that says the state should be in control or handle the major sectors of the economy, which I think really, maybe that's me, I think that's that is so 1970-ish, so to say. And why do I say so? A bit, I could segue a bit into China. You talked about China. And so if you look at China, China really brought those, about 300 million people into middle class by adopting the market mechanism or market model in regulating its economic affairs. And it was Deng Xiaoping who made this very pragmatic statement, which I think any country wishing to develop should hold on to. He said, it doesn't matter the color of the cat that killed the rat. The important thing is that the rat dies. And so that was to suggest that you needed to be pragmatic in terms of economic thought, in terms of governance. You needed to be open-minded in terms, if you want to progress development. So you saw, doctrinaire socialists or communists willing to think beyond fundamentalism to say, is there any other way we can advance the living standards of Chinese and develop? And they were willing to bend, or rather they were willing to tweak their institutions, maybe when you say reinvent the institutions by adopting the market model, which has worked for them. So I think that's the first, I guess that's the first point, that it's probably not essentially about the legal frameworks, but more about the strategic mindset. That's from an instrumental point of view, because managing the country is almost like managing a company, in terms of you must have, strategy, you must have a vision, and you must execute your plans well. So that is something that we need to bear in mind. But below that is also the point that it's also about what uses is power, state power put to. What are the ends to which state power is utilized? And that is where I would probably jump in with Dr. Amadi. And looking at law and development theory and institutional theory, law and development theory says you can use legal frameworks to cause social change. In the 60s, it was mostly about state capitalism and big government, command and control government. But in these times, it's more about institutional economics. It's talking about governance, good governance, rule of law, and it emphasizes the role of institutions in legal reform, in governance. And I think that is where we're getting it wrong in Nigeria. And I think that's, without even being ideological, that is where the problem is. Botswana, a country that has done very well in Africa, really has the opposite of our own arrangements in terms of natural resources. And that's where I go to what Gbite has said. At independence, Botswana determined that, pristine, or shall we call it, major natural resources shall belong to the state. So there was agreement that that was what they were going to do. So in Botswana, diamond and so on, there's nobody fighting about resource control, because the idea was that would be for the state to control, but it would be used in the national interest. So it's also about social contract. And that's why I say the natural law theory of chapter 2 is probably in the right sense. So but what also has happened in Botswana is that the leaders of Botswana have wholeheartedly embraced the rule of law. They have subjected themselves to the law and to the constitution and to discipline, frugality, in terms not only of management of the resources, but also in terms of, of social relationships. And so Botswana has done very well in terms of it's a middle income economy. And the discipline of governance is something that we certainly should be able to borrow from. And I think that's where we're failing in Nigeria, because of this inability to promote the rule of law, which is all embedded in the Constitution, in the various sections of the Constitution, in the more justiciable portions of the Constitution, in the setup of checks and balances, in the judicial system, even in some of the oversight institutions that are in the or arrangements that are in the Constitution, the Code of Conduct, Bureau, Code of Conduct, Tribunal, etc. So I think all the bits and pieces are there, but the spirit of, rule of law, that idea that power must not be untrammeled and governance cannot be arbitrary and capricious, and those who lead must lead in the national interest and must subject themselves to the dictates of the law. I think that is where the problem is. And if you look at the constitutional arrangements, I do believe, and I think Gbite was going in that direction, that it appears to be to centralize power too much. I think that's the result of the Civil War. Yes, it does centralize power a bit too much. I think we can talk about that. But I also believe that the state governance can still be better. There is no state in this country that does not have resources that, if that was all that Nigeria had, Nigeria could not develop. Look at a country like Singapore. What does Singapore have in natural resources? Well, yes, the situation of Singapore, the location of Singapore in Southeast Asia is one of the things Singapore has used to develop. But more importantly, they also did what the Chinese also did. Counterintuitively, when the world was practicing, import substitution, the doctrinal import substitution, and closed up markets, they opened up to, they opened up the economy, they opened up to the markets, market creating institutions, and they also have developed. And if you look at Southeast Asia, that is also something that has happened. So, talking about theory, maybe, the institutional theory, Roderick and Subramanian, for example, talk about the primacy of institutions. And when you look at China, why has it been successful? Look at Singapore, why has it been successful? More Singapore, maybe not so much of China. One of the things they've said is that you see in some of these countries that you have market creating institutions, which is what you have with China. You have market stabilizing institutions, market promoting, let's say law, not just law, market creating laws, market stabilizing laws, market promoting laws, which I think we have also in Nigeria. But it is the rule of law that I think is problematic. I'll finish by also going across again. Yes, I'll end on this point, and that's drawing a bit from what Dr. Amadi has said. We have to look at the political economy theory, and that is that law is not value free. It's not mechanical. It is the end product of politics, is the end product of economics. And so it is those power bases in society that really we must look at. And the way, African, political institutions have been described is that they are neo-patrimonialistic. They are more or less more like patronage systems. And it is that patronage was it now, rent-seeking nature, I think that has kept Nigeria where it is. Asimoglu and Robinson, for example, say, why are countries the way they are? They are the way they are because the dominant interest, political interest, economic interest, they prefer it to be that way because that's how it butters their bread. And so I think that's where I would leave it, that looking at, it's a multi-institution, we have to look, beyond just the technical frameworks, but also look at the political capitalism. In other words, the visible hand of market, but look at the visible hand of governments with the power housing configuration that puts it together.
Okay, I mean, thank you very much, Professor Ajai. I don't know to what extent, and these are very vital.
Any 1 minute response to him.
Okay, Dr. Amadi, please go on.
Yeah,
yes.
I think I agree with him totally. And the point I want to make, 2 quick points arising from his own, is that if you look at our constitution, there's just no way a country with that constitution can become a real economic power. It's clear. That is a wrong constitution. Just 2 quick points. He talked, for example, now, you have 2 countries that have different model of resource management. For example, as a water resource bill saying that all water should be federalizing ownership and management of water. Another country frees that for individual ownership and management or communities. So essentially the outcomes will be different. So the assumption here is not Israel. It's not about being theoretical or pragmatic. Like Ken says, those who think they are practical are actually slaves to mad economists or dead economists who are long gone. There's nothing like this. We are run on the wrong idea. And like Prof said, it's about what political economy we want and what outcome. Now take, for example, current PIB bill. Why are we always thinking that the minister must give approval for a regulatory agency to issue license? It says subject to the minister's approval. Now those things remain because our society is still neo-feudal, neo-patrimonial, like I said. The concept of it is a concept that you can't be a market economy. The ideological sense of a market economy is ethical individualism and uniformity, homogenization. So people count as just consuming units. Now, in our country where people count as ethnic and religious identities, you will just be wishy-washy to say you're going to create a market-based economy. So the point is that if you look at China, well, China didn't look so practical, but it's not that simple. The practical is sublimity. China looked at political theories, economic theories, and chose a system that was adaptive, borrowing from their communist state capacity to mobilize. If you go to China, bottom is democratic, middle is meritocratic. That's how China runs. China runs a democratic lower level, meaning that at the benefit of the small communities is based on one vote. But as people go, it becomes a meritocracy. So essentially, what I see wrong with our development is that we are borrowing artifacts and not the norms that creates them. So someone says market-based. How can you run a market where you are thinking it's neo-feudal, where you're not going to give the license to the person who is best to produce or who can pay more? So basically, I'm saying that, like you said, let's rethink the assumptions, the insights, and the structure of legal institutions, because ultimately, everything results in changing behavior, creating incentives for compatibility, and this legal framework. Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is, we are 1 hour in. We have just about 30 minutes to go. So our responses from this point on would have to be a bit more crisp. But that's a shame, really, because the combined brain power present here honestly should have had a lot more time. And I don't know, I'm probably going to take this feedback and see to what extent we can get this on. But let's see what we can achieve in the next 30 minutes. By the way, yeah, and I'm getting comments that from the participants that the discussion is very insightful. We have about 2 questions from George Ezeugo, but would ask those ones a little later on. We'll take a couple more rounds of contributions before I get to your questions, George. But thanks for being a part of this. and for posting those questions. By the way, this program is being monitored on YouTube and two Facebook platforms. So, and there are people logged in from all over the world. Once again, thank you very much for your participation and for being a part of this. So I want to pivot very quickly to Mrs. Uwais. You know, I'd asked you a question, which I thought I said you should hold in your left hand so that it doesn't disappear, which is to say, because you talked about the behavior, I mean, because one of the things I've heard is legal theories underpinning the legal framework upon which the culture and orientation is built. So I've seen a building emerge even from this conversation as it were already. In your own contribution, I'm sure the word perhaps would be lamented the culture of concentrating more on infrastructural development rather than human capital development and those sort of social investments that would really produce change. But the question would appear to be that people, I mean, persons in government and the politicians have the discretion to make those decisions. Is there any, I mean, is there any tweak that we can be looking to make to our law to ensure good behavior? Or, and that's one. Secondly, maybe while you're at it, I want you to also just share with us if there are models anywhere in the world that emphasizes social development in the way you talked about, and perhaps give us some insight into how the law helps them to be able to achieve that.
So I mean, I'm enthused by what I've heard, and I find the discussion very, very engaging, in the sense that the issue for me now is the way our politicians, you know, no matter what you write in the law, it's like in the courts. I know this is provocative, but having a just judge is much more important than having a just law, because at the end of the day, what the judge says is what the law is. And if he doesn't have the right mindset, he doesn't weigh all the issues right, and he doesn't apply the law according to justice, I mean, we're left with what we have. It's the same thing in the political space that we find ourselves. And unfortunately, even I don't see enough, you know, jurisprudence coming out on how to develop Chapter 2 rights. We have a whole chapter that says these are for fundamental objectives, and these are the directive principles of state. We also have a particular section there that commands all three arms of government, including the judiciary, to conform with and promote, you know, the provisions under that section. And yet we keep falling back to a section 6.6c, which says that they're not justiciable. Now, clearly there will be limitations because of that, but we do not take the time to interrogate, you know, what this really means. There are three components or even more in every clause that has these, in all of these principles. There's the directive, or there's a component to respect that clause, I mean, respect that right or that freedom or that objective. There's also a component that says do not violate. That is not a cost, that does not come as a cost. To go back a little, the reasons why all over the world, these clauses, these provisions that actually apply to uplift the rights and the welfare of our citizens, is because it's seen as a conflict between the separation of powers, and a judiciary cannot, for instance, just by a declaration say everybody must be educated, because that would depend on the resources that are available to the state, and the judiciary is not privy to the income that is being generated, that is not within their purview. And so they should not be seen as dictating what should be priority for the executive or the legislature. So instead of that, so that there does not become a situation where there's a crisis, there should be housing for all, or there should be health for all. You look at the section, it also means, don't respect the person's right to health, respect the person's right, or promote the person's right to health. It's not saying everybody must be given health today. For that, I believe we can have a progressive realization clause that's been utilized in many countries. It's put in their constitution, or we could even do it in legislation, because it is like antecedent to that. Progressive realization gives the courts the right to analyze the budget, to see whether the components of the budget of any state actually has the components that have human capital indices, the SDG goals, whatever it is that is required to uplift us, our citizens. And so if you do that, you also empower the state and the legislature to examine what is in the budget, to see that in fact the executive is conforming with the directive given to them under Section 13. I believe we can do that. In other countries, we've seen provisions like similar to Chapter 2 being enforced in other ways. You can talk about South Africa, you can talk about India. Those are the ones that are really popular that come out, and they use it. It takes a very innovative judge, a judge that is more like Justice Scalia, who looks at the intent, and the intent is what he feels is the intent, of course. And so the right to life, for instance, is seen as the right to have dignity, and the right to dignity means a person must have a house to live in, must have good food, must have, and this is the way, in a roundabout way, they've been able to use the rights under Chapter 4, which are enforceable, basically because it's don't do this, so the courts say don't take away freedom, don't take away liberty, freedom of association. All of those rights are much easier to enforce because they are a directive as to not to do certain things to people. There are certain rights that are entrenched, but the other ones under Chapter 2 are asking the states to do certain things that may have a component that actually would incur expenditure for the state. So, it's in Nigeria in particular, we have a very unique clause under the exclusive legislative list, and I'm sure that it is something that, it was placed there. I understand years ago I had an engagement with one of the, Rotimi Williams himself, Chief Rotimi Williams. We had a debate over this, and he said, we put that clause in just to try and find, a balance between what enforcing rights, but not enforcing rights. We have to find a way of ensuring that we're able to make sure these rights materialize, and unwittingly, what they've done is to say that the National Assembly can actually create an agency that will promote the regulation and enforcement of those rights. So this is the item 60 that was used under the exclusive list to set up NAPTIP, to set up the ICPC. The ICPC is based on Section 15, which is under Chapter 2. It says the state shall abolish corruption. Otherwise, if you don't go under item 60, you're left with what we have, for instance, under the Child Rights Act or the Violence Against Persons Prohibitions Act, which is passed at federal level, but you now have to go to every state and lobby for the state to pass a law. But what it says under it gives the National Assembly actually the power to create an agency that will superintend over those rights across the country, irrespective of the autonomy of each state. Now, I am a firm believer in the fact that we need to address the social space as one social space. We need to address nutrition, irrespective of the borders of our states. Now, I know this is anti-federation. There are certain things that I feel the federal should relinquish to the states. There are certain rights, certain items on the exclusive list that I feel really don't belong at federal on the exclusive list. But there are certain things, that over the years, I've come to believe we need to find a way of ensuring that we address them holistically, even if it means spurring a lot of competition between the states. But we need to be able to measure and monitor and enforce in a manner that ensures that no Nigerian is left behind, irrespective of what state you belong to. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, this is...
Sorry, one other thing though. Let me put in a caveat. Having seen what has happened in some of our agencies though, I also believe that it's possible for us to use, if we're working, if we can get the states to work in tandem with the federal government, even on a matter of policy, I feel we must get our act together in terms of the social space. So seeing an agency where everything is like a drain on resources, it's about bureaucracy, it's about, that actually makes me a bit hesitant about insisting that there must be a law setting of the agency. If we have a policy that states and federal government will sit together and work together and have their experts and work, multidimensional poverty needs to be addressed holistically. It's very important for us to just get that space in one place for sustainability and basically under the governor's office and maybe the presidency. So that, because all of these issues are cross-cutting. They're not, you can't be clinical about education without thinking about health. You can't do health without thinking about nutrition and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Uwais. This, in the balance of the younger generation, people were amazing. Certainly for, even for somebody of my experience, this is really like sitting in class again and just listening to this panel take us to the roots of what it is. So somebody said just judges, because again, that linkage to the appointment of personnel was really a very good one. And then of course, again, it says everything boils down to leadership. We have got the laws. That's what George says again, being his third contribution. But again, like I said, we'll wrap with the questions more properly speaking. There's one question for Dr. Amadi specifically. I'll read it, but Dr. Amadi, you wouldn't come on now because my next question really will be going to Gbite. And it says, what specific amendments would you suggest to our constitution for overall improvement of our democratic experience? And somebody again has a question for Mrs. Uwais. Says, you mentioned that a just judge is better than the best law. Doesn't this now downplay the need to build in strong institutions rather than having strong people who might come around every once in a while? So that's an interesting point. But Gbite, I don't know if you're still with us. Your image is off. But if you are, you started to introduce the subject of the exclusive list versus the concurrent list right through to the residual one. I was wondering if you wanted to deal with that a bit more.
Oh, thanks, Israel. So without trying to sound political, because this is basically a discussion in the context of economic development, I really think we need to take a very close look at those lists in our constitution, right? And try to tease out areas where states can more conveniently take over certain activities, and the local governments also do the same, and also the federal government, right? So basically, I think our 6-year experience has shown us that we need to shrink the center. It's very clear. The federal government is crowding the space for economic activity, and that ultimately affects development. And I've very clearly illustrated 3 areas where that can be done and it could make a big impact, right? The area of water use is also something that we need to look at, right? That issue is raging as we speak right now in the National Assembly, right? We need to look at that very carefully because this is about resources, and we've seen how struggle and contention over resources tends to lead to conflict, right? We can't continue to be in conflict, right, over a 60-year period, right? We're just basically fraying the foundations of whatever holds us together. Right. So I'm just going to speak generally, right, around the need for a revisit and a rethink, right, around the respective lists, right, in the Constitution and the respective powers of the levels of government. That's really what needs to be done. And we have to do so in a very forthright, honest manner between, amongst all the political potentates, because ultimately, right, it's about, political will. And it's not just a function of whoever is in office at the federal level for the time being. It's been a question that's afflicted us over the last 20 years. Should we allow this to happen for another 20 years? I'm not sure if you find the same Nigeria that you know today standing in 20 years' time if we don't sort this question out. So it's a real issue, right? That we have to very honestly address. That's how I will basically respond to that question.
Again, just before I leave you, before I move away from you, I think somewhere here where should I say, we're skirting around the question of restructuring. That's the dirty R word, and people don't want to engage in restructuring. But the challenge for me is the framework for restructuring. Constitutional restructuring. Is there a need for that? Or, is there a need for that? And what would be the mechanism for achieving it? Is it the good old constitutional conference? Because that, appears to be a jamboree that hasn't produced the right outcome. In terms of process, do you have any thoughts about that? Getting from where we are to where we want to be.
There are different ways you could do this. You could have a referendum, for instance, with questions to the people. That's one way. But I'm not sure if that would achieve much, because the question is, how informed are the people? Okay? But the political players are more informed. And this really, they are the ones that need to sit down, right? Okay, and sort these questions out. So call it political conference or whatever. Maybe that's what we've done. I'm not quite sure myself, to be honest, right? But I do know that in the last few years, the last 15 years or so, there have been a few conferences that have held, right? The issues are basically similar. If you look at the reports from all these conferences, same issues. So why don't we dust up those reports, right, and take them around the various state houses of assembly, state governments, and federal level, and just have them vote on that so that we know where we're going. It's basically for the political decision makers to take that decision.
Okay. So as we begin to round down now, I mean, there's no ending this. Just go very quickly to Dr. Amadi. There was a question for you, and maybe just starting where Gbite ended and the question that was posed to you. If you can talk to us in just about 2 to 3 minutes.
Well, I think let me just say something about. Probably I should start from the question that was posed to me and then get back to you. Somebody says, how should we restructure? I start from my knowledge of strategy. Strategy, there are 3 quick things about strategy. One is what we call the diagnosis, which is what's the problem. We move to the guiding policy, which tells you where you should be going, the basic framework you should adopt. And then the third one is a set of coherent action. For me, the diagnosis. First problem, the constitution, what we should change is the concept of nationality. Who are we? What are we as Nigeria? In strategy, we call it ideation. Now, Nigerian crisis has started, I call it the original sin, 1959, and it continues. The idea that Nigeria chose to be a multi-religious, if you like, rather than a secular democratic state. I posed that question to President Wahid, the former president of Indonesia, who is one of the most respected clerics. He told me that Indonesia, which is 180 to 90% Muslims, refused Sharia to be part of the constitutional framework because they wanted to be a modern state. And the problem is not Sharia. The problem is that we must have one legal system in Nigeria, one ideation, Nigerian citizenship. I heard Mrs. Uwais talk about the fundamental right provisions, which people argue should be constitutional or not. Of course, through executive brief, legislative advocacy, it can push some of those and they become law. The Supreme Court says they are part of the law, they are enforceable. But the critical question here is that the Nigerian statecraft does not have a concept of citizenship, what we call thick and thin citizenship. Thick citizenship goes to the concept of entitlement to support, welfare. Now, it's not about being a socialist or Marxist or capitalist state. All states developed in the West, from UK to US to Germany to France, they are stabilized because they have some degree of social support, which becomes part of the welfare economy. And we see whether it's in pandemic, the COVID right now, all the articles show that the extent that are doing well are those that have capacity in terms of healthcare facilities, which are product of law-based systems that say you must do this. Take, for example, South Africa. When South Africa moved from apartheid, the first thing they did was to constitutionalize socioeconomic rights, because you can't deal with massive deprivation except you create some level of entitlement that becomes a bargaining chip and becomes incentive for public policymakers to do those things you want: housing, hospital, road, and so on. So the Nigerian state is so elitist, so unaccountable. So you need to deal with that in the constitution. The second issue around the constitution is productivity. You can't have a constitution whose basic focus is on what people receive, privilege, entitlement, not on what people produce. So we need to create a constitution that allows people to eat their kill. The constitution itself does not lead for competition. And what we are hearing from all the people who talk about, whether it's Stiglitz or whether it's Douglas North, is that institutions that don't foster competition, head competition, are not likely going to create wealth. So our constitution creates entitlement and even produce disincentive for production, because it rewards those who don't produce and instead of those who produce. The third point I want to see in our constitutional reform is a constitution that allows for what I call local democracy. We are a local government, and then we made it an appendage of the states. But if you look at other models across the world, whether it is federal and cantonments or federal and states, there's some level of coherence in the structure. Our constitution is very, very incoherent. Now, take one example: right to life. People say, oh, we have right to life. But if you look at it seriously, the right to life is so qualified that it amounts to nothing. Police can kill you to protect property. What's playing on there? What's playing on is feudalism, neo-feudal sense, in which leaders themselves are so exempt from the common morality and common interactions of their followers. And that's why we still have government reserve area. So if you look at all our policies, what clearly shows through is that the constitution is not focused on creating a modern democratic state. So I want us to have a constitution not too big, but that creates an egalitarian society based on functional, productive values, and not a constitution that is so much concerned about preserving status quo. Don't forget that the status quo we are preserving is a status quo of pre-colonial feudal domination of different states across South and West, a status quo of colonial rule that was basically dependency and exploitation, and even a status quo of post-colonial rule that reinforced those outcomes. So primarily, you must have a clear constitutional theory before you start a constitution. What do you want to create? And that's why I call it ideation. Ideation. Who are we? What kind of people do we want to be? So we got it wrong from the beginning, and that's why I call it the original sin in the 1959 Constitutional Conference. We had the original sin, and that sin continues to put up. So for me, back to the question, the issue the last speaker raised, we really need to don't focus too much on this search for a good leader, a technocrat, Oxford, Harvard, or Soka, or IFE, or whatever it is, or like. We assume that leadership somehow will take us away from the determinism of institution and structure. That's not true. Whether you're reading Stiglitz or reading Douglas North or reading the guys who wrote Why Nations Fail, all theories show that critically you are constrained by your institution and how it's designed. And therefore, the most fundamental work is to use law and economics and other insights to retool your institutions. The biggest one is the Constitution. Then you come to other levels of law. So I would argue that the Nigerian Constitution disposes Nigeria to conflicts, to crisis. That's why after Civil War, we are still at the verge of probably another war. People are fighting for all kinds of republics. Why? Because we never settle the fundamental question in the design. So each time we say too much grammar and we settle on some, iteration at the margin, and then we just tweak things together, and we attempt to say we now had a process in which we sit back like we have in South Africa or we have in Singapore. We like to talk about Singapore. If Lee Kuan Yew and his guys did not change the ethnic composition of Singapore, gave more economic power to the Chinese and more political power to the Malay, you won't have this outcome. All these things they have impact on whether a society is wrong, well or not. So I want to end by saying this idea that expertise somehow, that Israel, Mrs. Uwais, Amadi, Professor Ajai, everybody, once we get this right, guys, somehow they will use their capacities, their intelligence, their innovation, and get us out of the determinism that our institutions have created will fail us in the next 60 years.
Okay, I mean, Nigeria at 60, what is ahead for us in the next 60 years? Somebody said that the elites, particularly the educated elites, have the responsibility to articulate the organizing logic. I'm sure somebody here recognizes that statement, which I heard from them a few years ago somewhere in South Africa. Professor Ajai, you're anchoring this for us, so you're a home run leg. I mean, you're bringing this home for us. We're actually out barely 2-3 minutes, honestly, that we have to wrap in terms of our time commitment to people. By the way, the feedback from the audience is really enthusiastic. I've commented like really insightful discussion, and I bear witness to that particular reality. So, Professor Ajai, my question really is again the same one I've asked. Process. How do we get from here to where we want to go to? I mean, and we've heard really insightful, conversations already in terms of the theoretical foundation to the legal framework. Again, like I said, to culture. The Mrs. Uwais, I thought engaged the issue of even the personnel from the get-go in terms of the personnel who even carry out what we already have, but I think we will all agree that we're not quite where we want to be, either in terms of economic development or social development. And those who have the responsibility of implementing programs and projects to realize any of those would appear to have far too much discretion to do what they want to do, and they're not exercising that discretion in our favor. What can we do? How can we get from here to there? Professor Ajai.
Well, I must say that, so we have seen that there are legal frameworks there. And if we look at economic history, mental history, it doesn't matter whether you are on the right or left or the center. I guess what matters, or what the theories and what practice has shown us, is that it is actually leadership, institutions and leadership. So institutions, I think, law is an institution, and law is an end product of politics and economics. So the Constitution actually reflects the configuration and balance of power. So you must go beyond the legal formalism. And of course, institutional frameworks matter. So if you, from Gbite's point of view, I do sympathize with him, because in the First Republic, we had what Professor Tony calls competitive communalism. The West does education, the East follows suit, the North follows suit. That was good, but probably also the constitutional arrangements favored that, because the resources were spread. Even though those governments, how do you call it now, took resources from the rural areas to the urban areas. However, they did help to progress, some measure of development. Not as equitable, because the rural areas were made poorer relative to the urban areas. So I think this constitutional framework can and should be tweaked as we go further on. It's too centralized, and all the revenue is there. So political power and the contest for political power is towards that end. And neo-patrimonialism means people win power. Well, the theories say so that they could use it for their ethnic groups. But I think later revision says, no, it's about grand corruption. It's not even about distributing it to ethnic what's it now? The ethnic communities. It's about people stealing money, and then maybe some trickles of it goes down. So it's governance. It's again the issue of governance, is again the issue of leadership. And I think even North did say in institutional economics that bad institutions, countries may have bad institutions, but good political leadership can help to turn things around. So I would end on that basis that, again, it's a question of leadership. And the issue of process of how do we get good leadership, I guess that would be, it may get a bit theoretical, but everybody has to be interested, everybody has to be involved. I don't believe, Acemoglu talks about the political elite, which is what Gbite is talking about. Things are the way they are because they benefit those who have the power, who have the economic means. But again, you have this theory of efficient corruption, profit-producing corruption, and so on and so forth. So look at Indonesia under Suharto. It was, a patrimonial country, but the friends of Suharto, after some time, were people who built industries, and Indonesia was able to develop, to a large extent. But if you have cronies who would rather spend the money, put the money abroad, or spend it on themselves, then that's not profit-producing cronyism, or even profit-producing corruption. So again, our problem is that of governance. And how do we deal with that? I think it's a question of political leadership. The issues about ethnic division is really is a red herring. It's the same contest for revenue without thinking about the national interest. And again, I go back to Botswana. The Botswanian leaders, time after time, succession after succession, put the country and the welfare of the masses ahead of narrow interest. The leaders of China, in spite of being communist, there's corruption in China, of course, have put living standards of their people ahead, and that is what they have pushed. So even without doing any radical restructuring, that's constitutional restructuring or legal restructuring, I think that is what we must aim for. When you look at our business environment and look at the legal structure, why do we have so much inefficiency? Why do we have such low productivity that even economic activity cannot thrive? again, I would put it at the back of irresponsible leadership. And if you had someone like a Chief Awolowo in that period with, you know, the political elite in the West who were able to advance the West to where it was, and, you know, Maryam is very right. They emphasized education. They emphasized those soft areas, and the West is benefiting for over 50 years from those investments. What has happened to our governors, even in the West, who have come? Is it not clear that you don't need to reinvent the wheel? Why can we not invest in things that have worked? Those people invested in education, they were invested in enabling infrastructure. And why is it a problem here? And what have you seen? Look at the educational system of Nigeria now. We're actually failing. Look at technology. So I think I will agree
Prof,
with Maryam that those are things that we should concentrate on. But how do we do it? It becomes a chicken and the egg type of situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. So I'll be going to Mrs. Uwais and Gbite for their last words. I'll begin with Mrs. Uwais, and it's in the form of a question. You have suggested that the Cap 2 provisions, which are generally described as non-justiciable, may in fact be justiciable if you combine them perhaps with other justiciable provisions, or indeed by some sort of creative should I say application of the law. So my question to you is, how would you overcome the issue of locus? Your microphone is muted.
The issue of locus has actually changed over time, and it's becoming more and more, you know, I think the courts are hampered also by the quality of arguments that's placed before them. Unfortunately, we don't have enough lawyers that are seized of these issues. And I don't know whether it goes back to our classrooms, our university days, the kind of emphasis we have on socioeconomic rights and how we can ensure we can come up with innovative ways. And this innovation doesn't need to come up only in the social space. We are in a position in Nigeria where we need innovation in every sector of our we need to think out of the box to ensure that we actually attain the desired objectives that we have for our country. So I would say that it's very, very important that we have this conscious effort in pushing the boundaries when it comes to socioeconomic rights. And this behoves on us as lawyers. And unfortunately, you know, even our judges, because our classrooms in the university days, many of them did not have too much of a focus. It's been on criminal litigation, commercial, all of that, you know. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. There are quite a number but they're not enough in terms of the needs for us to push the boundaries. So yes, it's very important for us to have institutions that are strong. But at the moment in our history, we also need very strong individuals. Political will, and I echo everything that has been said in terms of what the political economy means, because that disrupts all good intentions. You know, the politicians themselves don't have a sense. Many of them don't have a sense of what is required there are too many vested interests to be able to, to be inclusive of those who don't have a voice, who don't have a say, who can't engage and don't have, and whether or not we have laws that are about entitlement, there is a social contract that must be forged between leadership and the governed. And that can only be done when we have civil society, we have judges that are conscious of these, of the possibilities, even under Section 13 of the Constitution. We have a civil society that pushes for it. We have lawyers that are really aggressive about public interest litigation, ensuring that people have access to the rights that are actually theirs, even if we're not able to fulfill them immediately. We can compel the arms of government to begin to look at these and to give us explanations. If they haven't met the progressive realization clause, then the judges can give declarations that yes, it does not have, they have not, the particular government, and I speak now of state governments and the federal government, the particular government has not actually met the expectations of the Constitution in terms of the rights that are under Chapter 2. So I don't know if I've answered those questions. Institutions are important, but I mean, at this stage in our development, and I believe in every country that's developing, what we see emerging is, unless we have people that are informed of what should be done, and that is a process, it takes time, it's critical for us to have the right kind of people in the right places.
Right.
Otherwise, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I think you've engaged the issue rather exhaustively. So events like this and many more like it will be critical to enlighten, to educate, and to awaken the consciousness of the public. So, Gbite, you started, you opened us up and you're closing us. So, last thoughts, final thoughts. Your mic is muted.
Oh, I'm sorry. My appeal is this to all persons concerned. Please let it not be that our future is hampered by our Constitution and by our lack of willingness to do something about our Constitution. Our Constitution is broken. It is not fit for today, and it's certainly not fit for tomorrow. The world is moving fast. Let us very honestly, openly, and objectively revisit our Constitution and tweak those provisions that will allow this amazing and very clear potential that Nigeria has to emerge. That's all we appeal to the political players. It's in their hands. It's less the people, because it's very clear. Power is not with the people. Power is in the hands of the political actors. Yes, I heard Maryam, a number not as informed as they should be, right? But still there's some very savvy players amongst them. Because if anything goes wrong, as is likely to, in a no-do scenario, do-nothing scenario, the people will feast on those same politicians. So, and time is urgent. The time is now. Thank you, Israel.
All right. Thank you very much, Mrs. Uwais, gentlemen. So from wherever you have logged on to this particular webinar, time has just run out. We've actually overshot a time contract with you. I apologize for that, but the conversation was just good. I mean, was too good to truncate it abruptly. Yes, so I'm getting feedback. It's been time well spent. Great time. Sunday Okwe, who's been really very active on this platform, says, and hopefully the words that have been spoken here will reverberate to the quarters that they need to be. To whom much is given, much is expected. And I say this very constantly, that those of us who were trained, went to school, public institutions trained by state money and have acquired some enlightenment, some education, must not become complacent. We cannot keep quiet. We must continue to, to speak out and to engage, the issues, these social, economic, legal issues, with a very clear mind. I've said it before that we are the ones that are saddled with the responsibility of articulating and the organizing logic for society. and we cannot do it in a casual, lackadaisical manner, because that will be, for me, the cardinal sin. I don't know if it's the original sin, but it will indeed be the cardinal sin, because the things we say would eventually find their ways into laws, into guidelines, and all sorts of other things. So Mrs. Maryam Uwais, Professor Olawale Ajai, Gbite Adeniyi, Dr. Sam Amadi, ladies and gentlemen, from wheresoever you have logged in, thank you very much for being a part of this. A very happy 60th anniversary to Nigeria. We pray that we would not have this kind of conversation in another 50 to 60 years. As a matter of fact, that in the next 4 to 8 years, we would have witnessed the miracle of development. And whatever things constitute a blocker, I hope that we have the courage to be able to take those things away. Long live Nigeria. Thank you very much. God bless.
Thank you very much, Israel.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Thanks all. Bye.